Thank you, Daniel, and thank you for the invitation as well as for your opening remarks. Um, I must admit that I approached this afternoon's lecture with a certain amount of trepidation, as I feel that I'm venturing dangerously outside my architectural and historical comfort zone. I'm primarily an early modernist, and my knowledge, I hesitate to call it expertise, is in Anglican church architecture of that period and some of its continental influences. Nicholas Hawksmoor's death in 1736 normally marks the end of what I would normally consider as being my period. And of course, that's exactly the start of the Methodist age. So I was extremely reassured, both to hear your comments a moment ago and earlier on, to learn that part of the established tradition of the Wesley Lecture is to invite speakers who are from outside the Methodist tradition. And I can see that the advantages potentially in both directions. The speaker will learn a great deal as they prepare themselves, and hopefully the audience will hear a perspective from a different background, informed by different preconceptions, different types of experience. For me, it has indeed been a learning experience, and a very enjoyable one too, I have to say. There's probably much that I've missed, but I have been struck by a number of characteristics which I hope that you will find as fascinating as I have. My starting point is always to say that all buildings convey meaning to one degree or another, and that religious buildings do so more than most. Buildings say something about the patrons who commissioned them, how they saw themselves, including in relation to others, what they believed politically and spiritually, and how they wanted others to see them. There are complexities and nuances depending on whether the patron is a single person or an institution. And lessons one can learn about architecture in one culture or environment do not necessarily cross-apply to another. All of these apply to my topic for this evening, the architecture of early Methodism. I will limit myself to John Wesley's own lifetime, which already provides enough material for a monograph, rather than just a lecture. And I will only cover those buildings associated with the Wesleyan arm of Methodism and not with Calvinist Methodism of Whitfield and the Countess of Huntingdon. One thing I have observed is that there is a sense of contingency in early Methodist buildings. There's no single philosophy, structure, or style, but rather one of a developing sense of identity and purpose, and experimentation, conscious or not, with how to express that. Thus, the period is bounded by two very different buildings. At the beginning, the Foundry opened in 1739, and for some reason always spelt with an E. Why that is, I've got no idea. Perhaps someone could explain that later. Opened in 1739, and at the end, the City Road Chapel, which succeeded it in 1778. One is a borrowed and adapted building with no particular expectation of longevity, and the other is a confident declaration of permanence and independence. This does mean that there is not necessarily a progressive and evenly paced evolution of style and structure. But there are some continuities between Wesley's buildings and between them, and also with Anglican churches. But there's also much reinvention and a return to the drawing board. Both the continuities and the reinvention, I think, are rather interesting. Let us set a little context before we look at some of the buildings themselves. And here you really must forgive me for summarizing as succinctly as I can some of the early phases of Methodism. The story of early Methodist architecture does not really begin until 1739. By that date, the Oxford Holy Club was in the past, and the Wesley brothers had been to the American colonies and come home again in early 1738. John came back disappointed and disillusioned, mostly with himself and even unsure of his own salvation. His famous conversion experience at a meeting of a religious society in Aldersgate Street soon followed. Someone was reading from Luther's preface to the Epistle to the Romans, and Wesley later wrote, "About 9:15, while Luther was describing the change which God works in the heart through faith in Christ, I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did trust in Christ, Christ alone for salvation. And an assurance was given me that he had taken away my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death." He even italicizes the my and mine in the first printed edition when that quotation was set out. From that point on, everything changed. Wesley preached wherever he could, including famously in the open air. This painting is in the Museum of Methodism and Wesley's house and shows him preaching from on top of his father's tomb at Epworth in Lincolnshire. It is, I suspect, a decorous portrayal, and it certainly doesn't show the screaming, fainting and convulsions which so alarms the church authorities and which contributed to the churches in London and Bristol being increasingly closed to him. It was that loss of pulpits which was probably the main trigger for needing buildings of his own. And that's where the architectural story starts. So I would like to look at the three most important examples of early Methodist architecture, and one particularly interesting genre which came and went in the middle of this period. So I'll look at the two buildings which Wesley acquired in 1739, the New Room in Bristol and the Foundry in London. Moving on to the phenomenon of the octagonal preaching houses of the 1760s and 70s, and then finishing up with the City Road Chapel, which opened in 1778. But first, I want to consider some of the influences which would have been at work on Wesley, signs of which I think we can then see throughout all of these early buildings in various ways. Of these various influences, I don't honestly think that I can say that Lincoln College Chapel was one of them. Its movable pulpit, placed centrally in the aisle when used for preaching, comes closest, but was itself simply a reflection of a much broader pre-existing phenomenon. That phenomenon goes back to the early 17th century at least, but was greatly energized by Sir Christopher Wren and his notion of the ideal church. In 1711, Wren wrote to a colleague on the Commission for the 50 New Churches, a commission which was established to oversee the building of new London churches in a bid to ensure that the Church of England was well provided with buildings in the burgeoning London suburbs and could compete with the numbers of dissenting places of worship which had been legalized after the Act of Toleration, 1689. Though not expressed in evangelistic terms, that nevertheless was the Commission's underlying purpose. Wren applied his famously rational intellect to the challenge put before them. And he wrote, "The churches must be large, but still in our Reformed religion, it should seem vain to make a parish church larger than that all who are present can both hear and see. The Romanists, indeed, may build larger churches. It is enough if they hear the murmur of the Mass and see the elevation of the host. But ours are to be fitted for auditories. I can hardly think it practicable to make a single room so capacious, with pews and galleries, as to hold above 2,000 persons, and all to hear the service, and both to hear distinctly and see the preacher. I endeavoured to effect this in building the parish church of St. James's, Westminster, which I presume is the most capacious with these qualifications that hath yet been built, and which may be found beautiful and convenient, and as such, the cheapest of any form I could invent. What resulted was a series of churches throughout the rest of the century, which looked rather like this, with tall pulpits placed at or near the centre of a hall-like space, surrounded by galleries. There is nothing resembling a chancel of the sort that you would find in a medieval church or transepts. Instead, we see a broad basilican shape with galleries which direct all focus towards the pulpit. The triple-decker pulpit, such as we see here, is a much misunderstood phenomenon and often mischaracterized as creating a preaching box, in inverted commas. Thanks to wanton Victorian destruction, I couldn't provide you with an English illustration of a triple-decker pulpit in this position, though there were hundreds of them. Instead, this one comes from Newport, Rhode Island, in the USA. But I think it portrays rather nicely the sort of arrangement that certainly you would have found in any new built churches, Anglican parish churches in this period, and in a good many older churches which had been refitted at around the same time. Now, because so many of those pulpits have been removed, we easily forget that the bottom two tiers were liturgical. One was for the minister to lead divine service, and the other was for the clerk to lead the congregation in their responses and the psalms. It is therefore a uniquely Anglican creation, emphasizing a period in which the Church of England was both deeply liturgical and preaching, but at the same time was much less sacramental in character than it went on to be in the 19th century. The centrality of the pulpit, if not the triple-decker itself, was the principal abiding Anglican influence on early Methodist buildings. And I think it appealed to Wesley for two reasons. The first was the same practicality which Wren identified. Within a given space, you identified the location for the pulpit, which maximized its auditory effectiveness and visibility. The second is more complex, and it points to Wesley's long-lasting interest in the piety and worship practices of the early church. Those first few centuries as Christianity established itself before Constantine's adoption of the faith throughout the empire, and then as the church began to express itself in fixed public buildings afterwards. Wesley was not alone in this. Generations before him had all focused on the early church in the belief that it held the key to spiritual renewal. This was indeed a feature of Moravian piety, to which Wesley had been so drawn in earlier years. Protestantism from before the Reformation, if you will. This focus held that the closer you got in time to the practices of the early church, which contemporaries normally termed the primitive church, the closer you got to the pure and uncorrupted worship of Jesus. It was a perspective held by men and women of all theologies and all churchmanship. Irrespective of who held to that perspective, it usually included a desire to defend one's own churchmanship and ascribe authority and purity to it as against other forms of churchmanship with which one was in disagreement. Mostly, this was an Anglican versus Catholic set of dialogue, but it's not difficult to make a Wesleyan connection with his disenchantment with the Church of England and his desire to create something that was purer and more holy. Now, we know that Wesley read some of the principal texts on the subject, including William Cave's book, Primitive Christianity of the Religion of the Ancient Christians in the First Ages of the Gospel, Now, this was written in 1672 and incidentally was dedicated to Lincoln's own Nathaniel Crewe. This included an analysis of the architectural arrangement of early churches. Cave was a high church Anglican, and he modelled the interior of his own London church, built by Wren, on those principles. Yes, this is William Cave's church, All Hallows the Great in Thames Street, London, which sadly was demolished. Now, Wesley later published an abridged version of Primitive Christianity in his own Christian Library series, and he applied several of its precepts to Methodist buildings, as we shall see. And he also read and translated Claude Fleury's 1682 work under the title The Manners of the Ancient Christians, extracted from a French author, which, though less architecturally focused, likewise reflected the conviction that there was purity in the ancient. Others did the same, such as Peter King, in his An Inquiry into the Constitution, Discipline, Unity and Worship of the Primitive Church that flourished within the first 300 years after Christ. And there are more still, some of them with even longer titles than that. Common among all of these was the observation that early churches had their pulpit, or ambo in Greek, in the centre of the worship space, and that it was positioned forward from the east end of the church, often with a screen behind it. This plan comes from a book written by another London clergyman and a contemporary of Cave, William Beveridge. Although whereas Cave was a high churchman, Beveridge was what you might call low church, and theologically he was Calvinist. Again, illustrating the breadth of churchmanship that focused on these types of questions. This diagram, the iconographia ground plan, sets out what was fairly universally held to be the standard arrangement of an early or primitive church. Now, I can take you through the different areas. The early church, I'm not sure whether this is a bureaucratic mindset or what, but they had a tendency to subdivide worshippers into different categories based on their spirituality or the state of their spiritual development. You began your spiritual life as a wailer, lamenting your sins, and you would stand in the street outside the front of the church. As you progressed along your spiritual life, you would move into the portico area, progressed a little bit further and became a catechumen or a learner, and you would be in the narthex here. As catechumen, you would listen to the psalms, to worship, and to a sermon being preached from the ambo, the pulpit there. At the end of the sermon, you would be asked to leave the narthex and go outside into the portico because you're still not sufficiently advanced enough to come into the main body of the church. You progress from being a catechumen to one who falls before the pulpit, standing here. And then finally, you end up on the other side of the pulpit amongst the faithful. Here is a screen, and here is a communion table or altar, behind which sit deacons and the priest and a bishop if there happens to be one visiting. We're going to come back to that ground plan because I think it's quite relevant for the way that Wesleyan chapels were set out. And I'll pick up on those points as we go through. When I first started looking at this type of arrangement from Synodicon and other places, it struck me as being one that doesn't apply terribly easily to Anglican parish churches. At least in theory, the legal position in canon law was that to be English meant that you were a Christian and that you were a member of the Church of England, at least up until the sort of latter part of the 17th century. So to divide believers into these different categories always seemed rather a stretch of the imagination from the point of view of what the Church of England saw itself as being. I do wonder, though, whether from Wesley's point of view, it does make more sense. Perhaps not quite so much with that multiple gradation of different types of believer, but certainly from the point of view of starting off by the assumption that the people you are talking to do not believe, and that they have to be brought to repentance and belief, and then can advance in a spiritual way, if not a physical way, into the church. In this sense, the position of the pulpit symbolized that one came to faith and to the sacraments, which are behind the pulpit, through hearing and believing. Physical movement between spaces symbolized the Christian's spiritual development in the early church. Another primitive feature which Wesley espoused, at least for a while, was the separation of the sexes and the availability of free, unallocated seating. From the beginning, he wrote, the men and women sat apart. In this context, the women would often be seated in the galleries above, as they always did in the primitive church. None was suffered to call any place their own. They had no pews, and all the benches for rich and poor were of the same construction. By pews here, what Wesley means is that the enclosed box pew, not a sort of open bench pew as we tend to think of them today. The act of segregation itself is less interesting here than that he rooted its desirability in ancient practice and applied it in his own preaching houses. If it had been used by the early church, it was by definition holy and pious. Preaching houses. Now, that's an interesting phrase in itself, and it partly reflects Wesley's equivocal relationship with the Church of England. In these early years of Methodism, when Wesley continued to maintain that he was a committed member of the Church of England, he insisted that Methodist meetings should be held at times which did not conflict with parish church services, which meant that some were held at 5 o'clock in the morning, and also that Methodists should attend church and receive the sacraments there. Preaching house, the phrase that he uses, therefore supplements church and does not compete with it. And he also avoided the phrase meeting house, which was used by dissenters for their places of worship for the same reason. Now, this had changed by the end of his life, as we shall see, but it's an important feature of the philosophy of early Methodist architecture. I'm not sure that we should read too much into it, but it's also interesting to note an order which was recorded in the annual minutes of the Methodist Conference in 1765 that banned what it called tub pulpits and required the use instead of square ones with a long bench behind for the leaders of each gathering. Is this also a conscious way of differentiating preaching houses from parish churches, whose pulpits were overwhelmingly hexagonal tub pulpits, if you want to call them that way? And is there also an echo of the ancient ambo, which likewise had seating behind it for deacons? So we have pulpit there, and then finally at the back, this, there we go, this curved row of seating for deacons and for the priest in the apse of the sanctuary. For the same reason, it's also of interest to see the attempts to develop a building type which made it easily discernible from the outside that preaching houses were different to parish churches. One of the earliest of these was the octagonal preaching house. This is the very first one that was built at Rotherham. But that would be to jump ahead of ourselves slightly, and I think we need to begin at the beginning chronologically with the Foundry and New Room, both of which opened in 1739. And that, coincidentally, was the same year as the Wesley Brothers' Hymns and Sacred Poems was published. And I think it's probably relevant to put those two together. We are looking at a very conscious step forward in the spirituality of the Methodist movement. In a number of respects, the Foundry and the New Room both indicate the problems which Methodism was experiencing in maintaining the line that it was part of the Church of England. Wesley's decision to find or build his own places, as I've mentioned, was partly because of the difficulty which he and his brother Charles, and also George Whitefield, increasingly had in being allowed to use pulpits in parish churches. At the same time, the names Wesley gave them are revealing of his ongoing Anglican sense. As already mentioned, neither of these buildings was called a church, chapel, or meeting house. Right up until moving out of it, Wesley continued to refer to the Foundry by its former industrial name. And you can scarcely find a more basic name for the Bristol building than New Room. So there is something of a tension between these two forces. An ordained minister of the Church of England not wanting to burn his bridges, and yet the very acquisition of these buildings signals the process of detachment from the established church. And so does the very difference of these buildings and the fact that they gradually acquired the sort of functions and facilities which a movement which did not have the support of Anglican resources needed. Both progressively acquired additional spaces and included accommodation for visiting preachers and for Wesley himself. Being outside the parochial system, preachers did not necessarily have the benefit of a rectory or a parsonage house. But these two new bases had a greater significance in the development of Wesley's personal control over the growing Methodist movement, as he secured his own legal control over the physical buildings in order to ensure that he had control over the pulpits and who preached from them. Of these two, the Foundry in Moorfields is something of a ghostly presence, as we know little about its precise internal layout and how it was used. It was converted from a former cannon foundry, as you might have guessed from the name, which had been partly roofless since an explosion in 1716. It was a large site, which became well suited to the needs of Wesley's increasingly comprehensive form of ministry. Once fitted out, it provided a gallery space for 1,500 people, a second meeting room with a capacity of 300, accommodation for preachers and staff and for Wesley himself, a schoolroom, and later on, a free dispensary and an almshouse. This collection of functions may possibly have derived from Wesley's own experience, having visited the Moravian settlement at Herrenhut in Saxony the previous year, a visit which left quite a mark on him in a number of ways. And it's a remarkable expression of the expectation of spiritual renewal that the membership of the Methodist band, which first met at the Foundry, was only one of 75. And yet they accommodated themselves in a building that large. A pulpit from the Foundry survives and is in the Museum of Methodism attached to the City Road Chapel. A very plain affair. I can't quite work out from photographs I've seen of it, not having seen it in person, whether it's oak or some sort of pitch pine or something like that. The yellowness suggests pine. Given that Wesley acquired a lease on the Foundry in 1739, the same year that the New Room opened, it seems reasonable to assume that they operated on a similar basis, within the constraints of adapting an existing building and catering for much, much larger numbers. It was nevertheless Wesley's principal London base, providing him somewhere in the capital to match his Bristol base. And it remained so until the opening of the City Road Chapel in 1778. The New Room in Bristol had a similarly contingent feel to it, but in a slightly different way. It was also adapted and added to fairly rapidly as need arose, with a large extension in particular being added in 1748. Its exterior was fairly unprepossessing and slightly hidden away, perhaps deliberately, given how much physical violence was sometimes directed at Methodist gatherings. Although at different times the new room has suffered from neglect and running up against rather challenging ideas from town planners, it has nevertheless lasted longer than Debenhams, which you can see on the right-hand side in this photo, which I assume comes from before 2021. One thing that the new room does have in common with Lincoln Chapel is that it is now in much better condition than it had been for decades before. A restoration program was carried out in 1929 to 30, which aimed at restoring it to its original state. And the colours in which it is now painted are based on analysis of the many layers of historic paint. The restoration did involve a number of compromises along the way, especially in relation to the seating. The original room did not have pews at ground level, but rather backless benches like those in the gallery, which look supremely uncomfortable. And in fact, being uncomfortable seems to have been one of the objectives of the restorers. And the Bristol architect in charge, Sir George Oakley, exulted that the congregation shall be as uncomfortable as of yore, and we must hope that they will be so transfigured by the spirit of the meeting that they will forget their physical discomfort. The double-decker pulpit, not a triple-decker, retains some of the original joinery and is a part recreation, but it is faithful to the original form, as we can see from earlier illustrations and engravings. Together with the balustrades and this slightly sort of complicated staircase structure with stairs going off in both directions to the side. Access to the pulpit is from the side at gallery level, not from below, and there is a connecting door which leads to the preacher's house behind. It's a curious, slightly cut-off arrangement, but the stairs to either side, again, put me in mind of some of the early ambos that I mentioned before. A lot of these, not all, but a lot of them had staircases either side. One would rise up one staircase and then leave by the other staircase. The galleries in the new room are supported by Tuscan columns, Tuscan being the earliest and crudest of the canonical classical orders of architecture. As well as being the cheapest to use, having the least amount of decoration, perhaps there's also a reference being made here, again, to the primitive church. I think the restorers were right to be pleased with their work. In the words of Ferrier Hume, one-time president of the Methodist Conference at the time that it was reopened, the new room had a charm that is peculiarly its own. Its simplicity and quaintness are quite unpretentious. It is witness to the lowliness of our origin. Let us move on now to the octagon preaching houses, which followed in later years, skating quickly over the problem that what happened during the 1750s is rather poorly documented and very sketchy, and very, very few of the early chapels survived from that period. For the most part, borrowed rooms in cottages seem to have been the order of the day. Octagons are not normally what we would think of as being church shapes. So where did these come from? There were, in fact, two such churches amongst Christopher Wren's output in London, St Anthelin and St Bennet Fink. But their shape was determined mainly by the complications of the site that he had to work with and by a typically Wren enthusiasm for playing with geometrical shapes. I don't think he was making an ecclesiological point. Having said that, John Wesley did preach at St Anthelin in 1738, and St Anthelin was, moreover, a centre of evangelical preaching. Before the Great Fire of London, it had been one of the most noteworthy Puritan parishes, and it retained a strong preaching ministry with daily lectures throughout the rest of the century and into the 18th century. So perhaps there was a conscious or subconscious sense of coupling of shape and preaching which entered Wesley's mind and made him ponder. However, I suspect that the main influence on him was again the desire to differentiate his buildings from churches, both from pre-Reformation churches, often in cruciform shape, and from post-Reformation churches, often basilican, and to have something which was highly distinctive and could be identified directly from the outside. Now, you can find others reaching the same conclusions across the decades and in different locations, very probably independently of each other, but likely drawing from the same set of underlying sources. Thus, the first purpose-built Dutch Protestant church was octagonal, the Koepelkerk in Willemstad, which was built in 1607. Koepelkerk means domed church. And so were several of the Huguenot temples in France, such as those at Caen, Lyon, and La Rochelle. Here we have Caen and Lyon. If you look at the left-hand one, the Lyon one, the painted depiction, note the mix of the seating there. There are some very, very basic and again distinctly uncomfortable looking open benches for some people to sit on, but also may not be large enough on the screen for you to see, some upholstered pews decorated with fleur-de-lis, a reminder that the Huguenots counted princes and aristocrats among their number, and seemed not to have been quite as concerned as Wesley was for equality in places of worship and preaching. Now, I have a slight memory that the terms of the Edict of Nantes, which allowed Huguenots to build their own places of worship, also required that their buildings should not look like churches as generally understood. But I've not been able to find a source for that. And I mention it now in case someone is able to remind me of what that source might be or whether I dreamt it up in some way. But in either case, I think these Dutch and Huguenot examples are indicative of worshipping communities which are outside the established church mainstream, and ones which were wanting or needing to find ways of demonstrating their different character and wanting to build places of worship which are well lit and suitable as auditories. The Dutch and Huguenot examples also self-consciously referred to early church practice. Back in 1450, Leon Battista Alberti had asserted in Book 7 of his De Re Aedificatoria that the perfect form for a place of worship was round, and that early Christian places of worship had been so. He goes on to say that octagons, hexagons, dodecahedrons, and rectangles are all derived from the circle and are therefore all appropriate as well, which slightly makes you think that the value of being round has been diluted beyond any sense of meaning. There were indeed some early churches which were round or geometric. There are the remains of some octagonal early places of worship, mainly in the Holy Land. There's the 5th century Church of Mary, the Mother of God on Mount Gerizim, and a church in Capernaum, sometimes referred to as Peter's House. But they were far from universal, and they related more to martyria, mausolea, and baptistries than to places of congregational worship and preaching. But the view persisted, and Huguenot temples in particular seem to have been built with this principle very much in mind. Given Wesley's own reading and interests, there does seem to be a clear point of connection here for him, and I think combined with other considerations. But the proximate inspiration, the immediate point of departure, if you like, came from two early English examples. The first was the Presbyterian chapel in Norwich. Wesley visited in 1757, and he wrote, "I was shown Dr. Taylor's new meeting house, perhaps the most elegant one in Europe. It is 8 square, built of the finest brick, with 16 sash windows below, as many above, and 8 skylights in the dome, which indeed are purely ornamental. The inside is finished in the highest taste, and is as clean as any nobleman's saloon. I'm not sure he's being entirely complimentary when he says that. The communion table is fine mahogany. The very latches of the pew doors are polished brass. He's definitely not being complimentary. Incidentally, the Duke University scholar Karen Westerfield Tucker notes that when Wesley comments here about the Norwich octagon being perhaps the most elegant one in Europe, that this suggests that he did indeed have some knowledge of others on the continent in order to be able to make that comparison. Perhaps he had seen some on his travels in Germany and the Low Countries in 1738. It's certainly an interesting thought. And the second example is one that he must have seen, which was his friend George Whitfield's octagonal chapel on Tottenham Court Road, built in 1760 and just a 10-minute walk from the foundry. So it may not be surprising that he appreciated the idea of the octagonal shape as being distinctive for the type of non-parochial buildings which he wanted to propagate. And the following year, in 1761, he was himself recommending the use of octagonal preaching houses. When the one in Rotherham was opened, he wrote, "I preached at Rotherham in the shell of the new house, which is an octagon. 'Tis a pity our houses, where the ground will permit it, should be built in any other form." By 1770, he was mandating them. The minutes of the Methodist conference of that year required Methodists to build all preaching houses, if the ground will admit, in the octagon form. In passing, it seems to me that the quite sort of highly regulated Methodist approach to discipline and the role of the Methodist conference in setting rules, at least in this early periods, adds to my sense that these buildings seem to run in sequential phases. First, like the new room, borrowed rooms, adapted rooms in a very contingent way. Then a phase of octagons running from 1761 to 1776. And finally, those modelled on the City Road Chapel. In all, there were 15 built on the octagon model. I put them here on the screen. The ones in red no longer exist. The one at Whitby dramatically fell into the sea in 1787. The ones in green still survive, though they may not survive being used as places of worship. The oldest of those which does survive is at Stroud, built in 1762 to 63. Now, I think still appropriately used by the Salvation Army. And there are others at Yarm from 1763, Heptonstall, 64, Arbroath, 1772, and Taunton in 1776. Now, these have mostly been quite heavily adapted. Heptonstall, for example, is no longer an octagon. It has been stretched into more of an oval shape, albeit with the three sides of the octagon at either end. And the Taunton octagon was sold in 1812 and is now, I believe, an accountant's office. A description from 1791 tells us that the Taunton octagon is a neat building, 40 feet in diameter, conveniently pewed, 12 handsome windows, 6 of which are circular, render it light and cheerful. It is furnished with a curious timepiece and accommodated with a good vestry room. Before it is a spacious court enclosed towards the street with a large iron gate and palisades. I think the rather sort of cataloguing approach to describing it sounds like an entry from Pevsner, which I rather like, despite being written quite a lot earlier. Of the octagon at Yarm, Wesley wrote, this seems to have been one of his favourites, "Why should not any octagonal house be built after the model at Yarm? Can we find a better model? It is better for the voice, and on many accounts more commodious than any other." Reputedly, he also added, "And there are no corners for the devil to hide in." In 1780, the large minutes of the conference recorded the instruction, "Let all preaching houses be built plain and decent, but not more expensively than is absolutely unavoidable. Otherwise, the necessity of raising money will make rich men necessary to us. But if so, we must be dependent upon them, yea, and governed by them. And then farewell to the Methodist discipline, if not doctrine too. Presumably for similar reasons of plainness and decency, Wesley even went so far as to prohibit what he called Chinese paling or railings in the Chinese Chippendale style outside preaching houses. And we see this reflected in the cost of most of the buildings. The Nottingham octagon, for example, cost only just over £128, though the much larger one at Chester cost £977. At that price, I wonder if the Nottingham octagon was timber framed rather than brick or stone, as many of the others seem to have been. So it begs the question, if Wesley was so enthusiastic about octagons, why did they stop? I suspect the reasons were several, but two in particular. First is a practical one. The roof span required is a difficult one to scale up unless you want to build a vault, and vaults are expensive and structurally more complicated. So as the movement grew, octagons were less effective ways of housing congregations. Secondly, the early economical approach to building them, as at Nottingham, presumably also came with very limited durability. Thus, the combination of growing numbers within the movement and the short lifespan of relatively cheaply built premises, which could not be scaled up, combined to limit the usability of the model to the early Methodist period. If we look at those that do survive, it's interesting to note that they were generally added to with large side extensions, rather than being replaced with larger octagons. And finally, we come to the City Road Chapel. Bearing in mind Wesley's earlier sensitivity about the terms church, chapel, preaching house, meeting house, it's interesting that he referred to the planned new building as a chapel right from the very beginning, when they first started thinking about it in 1776. When it became apparent that the lifetime of the foundry was coming to its end. Even if he had not yet completely broken with the Church of England, though when he began to ordain ministers in 1784, that was something of a milestone. We can see that this building, which opened in 1778, is an altogether different proposition from the early preaching houses, both in scale and in self-confidence. Decent it may be, plain it is not. The facade is that of a handsome and polite Palladian villa. Even though the chapel was built in the late 18th century, as with nearly all buildings I'm ever called to comment upon, such as All Saints Church, Lincoln College Chapel, the building accounts have been lost. And consequently, we don't know for certain who the architect was. George Dance has been mooted as a candidate. He was the architect of the Mansion House in the city, for example, or possibly one from his office. Whoever he was a competent and probably professional architect, knowledgeable about the historical sources that were relevant for a building such as this. The front does, I think, bear comparison with two houses in Bristol, with which Wesley must have been familiar, and I wonder whether they also informed the design here. This one is Clifton Hill House by Isaac Ware, which was completed in 1750, and the other is the Royal Fort by James Bridges. The chapel is simpler than these two, but it's a world away from the genuine simplicity of the New Room and the Foundry. The interior of City Road Chapel has been altered considerably since Wesley's day, especially in its seating, which was sparser and more basic at the beginning. This coloured drawing comes from about 1861, before some of the more drastic changes were made in the 1880s and later. The galleries, which are now raked with fixed pews, originally only had two rows of simple benches, which I would imagine would be rather like those that we saw at the new room earlier on. And the space behind was for people to stand. There was also standing space at ground level, which since then has been completely filled up with pews. So in that respect, at least, it was plain. However, the scale of the place, the sculpted plaster ceiling, the pillared galleries with stylishly classical panelled fronts, the lofty central pulpit, which when first erected was 15 feet tall, and what I can only describe as a high church Anglican reredos in the apse. You here see the boards with the text of the Ten Commandments, the Lord's Prayer, and the Apostles' Creed. All of these features are 18th century adaptations of Wren's ideal church of St. James's Piccadilly. So we seem to be seeing some sort of return to Wesley's own high church roots in the way that the chapel is furnished. The ceiling was recreated to the original design after a fire in 1879, as well as straightforwardly decorative features. At its corners are these sunbursts representing the divine glory, with winged cherub heads in the center. I suspect that the gilding on these dates to the 1970s refurbishment rather than being original to Wesley's time itself. But the basic iconography of it is still quite striking. There is more moulded plasterwork in the spandrels of the apse arch and within the apse. And the reredos, which you've just seen, is made of mahogany and has another glory in the pediment. Lastly, the classical triglyphs along the gallery fronts are interspersed with a dove with an olive branch in its beak, surrounded by a snake eating its own tail. If these two were part of the original scheme, and I'm not 100% sure I've been able to find out whether that's the case or not, then they're certainly a departure from the plain and decent rule and are a confident Methodist venture into figurative art. The snake is a slightly puzzling symbol here. It's not the serpent of the Garden of Eden and is quite rare in Christian iconography. Ultimately, it's derived from an ancient Egyptian symbol for rebirth. So maybe in a Wesleyan context, it represents conversion or possibly resurrection, but it is unusual. Crucially, the mahogany pulpit was a triple-decker. This is significant as it shows that the functions of the earlier places used for singing and preaching had been superseded. City Road Chapel is more than a preaching house. It was there for the full liturgy of the Book of Common Prayer, including the sacraments. There was a communion table behind the pulpit and a font in front of it. These were liturgical and sacramental features which had been absent in the early days of the Bristol New Room and the Moorfields Foundry. Despite Wesley's assertions to the contrary, it's difficult to see how this was not in competition with the nearby parish church of St. Luke's, Old Street. Overall, this feels like a denominational venue. And while earlier preaching houses were deliberately designed not to look like parish churches, this most definitely does look like a parish church, at least understood in the 18th century. Now, if you cast your mind back to Wesley's interests in the early church, there are some obvious comparisons to draw with the ground plan of an early Christian church that we looked at earlier on. We see a galleried main space with the pulpits placed in the centre. At City Road, there is no screen behind the pulpit to block the view of the sanctuary, but the massive bulk of the pulpit did so instead before it was cut down. And we see an apse, which contains the communion table. Now, primitive Methodism is, of course, a later phenomenon of the Methodist movement and means something rather different. But City Road Chapel is a primitive church on the model described in 1672 by William Cave and William Beveridge. And it was a model which Wesley himself had clearly studied and absorbed. A new chapel in Bath opened the following year, smaller, but to the same general design as City Road. And in 1790, Conference issued a new mandate ordering that all preaching houses are to be built in future upon the same plan as the London or Bath chapel. To conclude, by the time of Wesley's death in 1791, Methodist buildings had come a long way from the Foundry and New Room to the City Road Chapel. Collectively, the preaching houses of this period constituted a series of architectural experiments, as Wesley and his followers sought to give physical expression in stone and brick to their beliefs and identity, as well, of course, as serving their practical needs. As Wesley progressively detached himself from the Church of England, and as the Methodist movement grew hugely in numbers, that identity and set of practical needs changed too. And we see that reflected in their changing style and approach to building. City Road Chapel is not, of course, the end of the story. The religious evolution of the nation continued in the 19th century and became markedly more architecturally apparent after the Catholic Emancipation Act of 1829. The decades which followed saw an explosion of church and chapel building by all denominations in what became a highly architecturally competitive environment. And there's something of an irony that whereas 17th and 18th century dissenting and Methodist places of worship were deliberately designed not to look like Anglican parish churches, by the late 19th century, many were indistinguishable from them, or at least from the more sober ones at the low church end of the spectrum. Here is the Methodist St. John's, Whitchurch in Shropshire, as an example, which opened in 1879, and it even has a saint's dedication attached to it as well. This generation of churches were mostly built in cruciform Gothic style. Many had stained glass, and towers, some with spires. Here, slightly later, Four Oaks Wesleyan Methodist Church in Sutton. What would Wesley have thought, I wonder? Speaking of stained glass, I end with this window from Chester Cathedral, showing John Wesley standing in front of Lincoln College front quad. What would he thought of that too? Thank you.